easier. So Sol Systems over here, and Tyrol is all the way over here. So you can see it's sort of on the east. I mean, we sort of use, or I use these sort of east, west, north, south things. It's not actually obviously what these are.
Just got the lawmakers Guide to the Galaxy going on in the background.
Not
it's mostly for
linear,
visuals here.
flat, plane thing, but it's just easier when you're looking kind of straight down on it to kind of guide you. So it's over here, kind of over by, you got some Banu systems down here. Kins is probably the closest to Banu space. You got one jump through Karen down there, and a couple jumps away from Indra, which is Xi'an over here. So actually, Tyrol system is actually was a stretch goal system from the 2012. Interesting enough. So it has been around for a while. Little background about the system: it was discovered in 2823 via this jump point from Karen's system, and the explorer who discovered it was named Damon Huerta, who was a resident of actually Karen 3. I'll kind of jump in here just to do a little fun. So here we have Karen 3, and so he was actually from here and lost his home and family during the Civil War, and the Civil War had actually resolved in a ceasefire, so it didn't technically end.
It's another one that's fallen out of its
display. But he was basically unwilling to leave the system that had been his family's home for generations, and it was the only one that he had known, but at the same time he refused to go back to the planet that had basically kind of caused him so much suffering. So he basically had kind of spent a lot of his time living on the drift, you know, spending equal time picking up odd jobs around the system and crashing at different stations and whatnot when he could afford it. And so the discovery of the jump point over to Tyrol kind of came at an opportune moment because he had actually come dangerously close to being forced to sell his ship. So it worked out well for him. But unfortunately for the system, the UEE didn't end up claiming it, but let's head in and that will actually explain why. So, as you can see right off the bat, we have a binary star system, which is super cool. This is a white dwarf, and this, more importantly, is a main sequence star that has entered this sort of subgiant phase of its evolution. So basically, the system's about to blow up in a bad way. So needless to say, the UEE was not really enthusiastic about trying to colonize a system that could blow up at any time. So they basically kind of left it alone.
Pretty sure it's the wrong.
But and actually, interesting thing too, while I'm on it, is originally, if you go back, like the original write-up for the system was actually it was a single star system, which is the star that had entered the sort of red giant phase, but the, obviously the Nova thing was still kind of a key point to it, but it was just a single star. And when we circulated a lot of these systems out to our consultants who were sort of helping us with the kind of astrophysics, offering their insight and expertise into the science of stuff, Steve and one of them basically had tackled the system, changed it to a binary. So he added this sort of white dwarf companion to it, and to quote him, basically the main sequence star has just left the main sequence and is becoming a subgiant. It's now big enough so the outer layers are being sucked up by the white dwarf for the first time, and this will lead to a smaller explosion called a nova that will be destructive enough. This was actually an interesting point. It will be destructive enough to be a cataclysmic event in the entire system, but not significantly enough to affect neighboring systems. So he also went on to explain that basically like these novas could kind of happen several times, and the white dwarf could potentially ultimately go supernova, which would be bad for basically everyone. So yeah, fun times. But anyway, that was sort of the kernel of the idea of the station. It was this idea of a system sort of on the brink of destruction that was sort of the hook into the character of the system. And it was just an interesting idea to think about that, like, even though in the sort of timeline of, cosmic and space events and stuff like that, it's obviously over a hugely protracted amounts of time of hundreds of thousands and millions of years and stuff like that. But at a certain point, they have to, there has to be that moment of it doing something, that moment of change. So, so this was just this idea of having this really fragile system that, like, any day it could disappear, basically. So, I don't know, it just seemed like it had a lot of potential to be, lead to some really interesting kind of storytelling and possibilities and characters and stuff like that. Like, who would move here, stuff like that. So, anyway, getting on to sort of the makeup of the system itself, you have got 7 planets here, and I won't go into too much detail because I highly advise poking around in the star map itself.
Oh, this it's a spelling mistake
and looking up the data and stuff like that. So I'll just kind of focus on more of the kind of the interesting ones. So, as I said earlier, while the UEE didn't necessarily claim Tyrol, it didn't mean that they weren't interested in it. The scientific community, particularly, was immediately entranced with this opportunity to set up research stations, data collectors, whatever, just to be able to study such a potentially massive event up close, and it just offered kind of potential breakthroughs in understanding how the universe works and stuff like that. And, interestingly enough, it's sort of a counterbalance to other systems like Talos, which was one, if you remember, is sort of in the process of forming, and still that sort of forming the planets and all that stuff. So this is sort of the opposite, and they're equally fascinated with that. So this is the opposite of the spectrum. So this is about the death of a system rather than the start of one. The closest, if you go over here to Tyrol 1,
new mission giver.
Basically, our first kind of habitat here is actually over on the moon called Lanisto. And it was basically set up by a research company to study, the event theoretically up close. So you can see proximity-wise here, it's a pretty good seat to check things out. Unfortunately for them, it didn't blow up quick enough for them, so they kind of ran out of funding, and they had to shut down the research station. So, unfortunately,